Backpack Radio. Backpack Radio. A one-of-a-kind radio program that features live debates, call-in questions, and expert guests. The focus of Backpack Radio is to highlight what God's Word has to say about religion, truth, and culture. To do this, we engage in the discipline of apologetics. Apologetics is the communication and defense of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And now your hosts, Tommy Boy and Vocab Malone.
Just to start out, I am an atheist, but you don't have to not believe in Jesus as a historical person to be an atheist. In fact, I was an atheist perfectly fine with the idea of there being a Jesus. In fact, 15 years ago, it didn't even occur to my mind there might not have been a Jesus. And so this is still a hard sell, even for some atheists. So I want to put that out there right there.
Right.
And in fact, the only reason I even make such a fuss about it is not because I need it for like anti-theological reasons, but because I think that's how Christianity began, is this way. So that's kind of a long-winded introduction, but the other thing I want to say is that all the arguments we got in this book, I mean, this is a 250-page book I've got here, and it's a distillation from a about 700-page book that was the original one. So we're not going to get everything done today, but I just want to start out with a few basic things. And one of the biggest problems I have with the idea that there was a real Jesus is the difference we see in Christianity from the time of the Gospels on and from before the Gospels. And today, we're focusing on extra-biblical witnesses, extra-canonical witnesses, if you will, corroboration for the Gospels. And that's something where I have a big problem with the traditional story of Christianity, the official picture, because especially when you're talking atheists, who say, well, yeah, I know Jesus wasn't the Son of God, but there was at least a guy. That's one level of evidence. But when you're talking to most Christians who believe that all the miraculous events in the Gospels actually happened, then you've got a real question of, then the argument of evidence from silence becomes really genuine. Because, for instance, if we just take the one verse in Matthew where he says that all the saints in Jerusalem cemetery rose from their grave, came out, wandered into the streets of Jerusalem, appearing to many. That's just one verse, and yet we have no corroboration for that, not even from the other Gospels. And what's more is that we do have information about things that were going on in Jerusalem at the time from people like Philo of Alexandria, Nicholas of Damascus, Justus of Tiberias. We know that people were, maybe not the Roman Empire wasn't forefront on their mind, but we know there were people who were interested in Jerusalem. And so it floors my mind, first of all, that if this thing really happened, and again, this is just one of the many miraculous things that are meant to have happened in the Gospels. If that happened, how is it that only Matthew recorded it? And how is it that people talk about much less interesting things going on at the time, but no one mentions that the dead rose in Mass?
Let's start there. You mentioned Justus of Tiberias. The way we know him is a 9th century Christian writer named Photius read the work, and then he says Jesus is not in the work. Now, the title of this work, David, was A Chronicle of the Kings of the Jews, and Photius describes the work of Justus as this, quote, he begins his history of Moses and carries it down to the death of the 7th Agrippa of the family, the last line of the king of the Jews. Now, here's the thing. This work seems to be focusing on actual political, kingly rulers of the Jews. And so a Christian is saying he should have included Jesus as the king of the Jews. But see, for him to have done that, you understand that he would have to have believed Jesus the king of the Jews. So here's my question. Why do you mention Justus of Tiberias as someone who should have mentioned Jesus in this, when the only way he would have done so is if he held that Jesus was the king of the Jews because he had a political work? There's no reason why I should have mentioned Jesus.
See, that's where I would disagree with you for one thing. All the people I mentioned as potential witnesses, all of them are just that, potential witnesses. And I ignore all the ones who just happen to be alive at that time and writing at that time. I don't include anybody in the book unless I think there was a reasonable chance for them to have reason to mention Jesus. And the reason I mention Justus of Tiberias is that if he was doing the Chronicles of the Kings all the way through Agrippa II, then he had to do Herod the Great. In fact, there's no way he could have done any kind of history of the kings without including Herod the Great. He was the greatest king of that time. But we don't have any trace of anything, according to the patriarch Photius in the 9th century, who said this, who sniffed that, it's just because he's a Jew, he ignores everything that happened about Jesus. But when you look at all the big ticket items in Jesus' career, including the slaughter of the innocents in Bethlehem, including all the miraculous things and the earthquakes.
You're not answering specifically why justice should have had
That's what I'm saying, is because there were so many things that are miraculous in Jesus' career that would have affected the entire kingdom as a whole. It boggles the mind that if these things happened, no matter what he thought of Jesus, whether he was just a Jew or the king and Messiah, whatever, these other things should have made an impact.
But so you have a list of all kinds of people that I wonder why you included in there, like Pausanias, he's a geographer who wrote descriptions of Greece. Sextus Empiricus, who lived 160 to 210 AD, who's a physician and philosopher. Now, even if Sextus would have included Jesus, which I don't know why he would have, given his credentials, would you really accept it, given that he's in the 160 to 210 era, that's when he's writing? You see, even the sources you say should have mentioned Jesus, they're too late for your actual standard that you apply when you say, well, yeah, this guy mentions Jesus, but it's too late, he never knew him. So I don't know why you mention them. It almost seems like resume padding.
Well, it is resume padding in a sense, because that comes from the section of saying other guys that are also, they're not my top 10 tier at all. Those are also the list of guys. And there's probably even more names off that I didn't mention, but still, they had an interest in geography or the region or mythology. All of them had a particular bent that could have led to it. But here, let me say something about that too, because you made a good point. None of these are contemporary. And that's an important thing to say, is why don't we have contemporary eyewitnesses for during when these events were actually happening?
Who would be the people that were writing that you know of that were contemporary at the time?
Well, let's go with Philo of Alexandria.
Okay, how many times did he visit Jerusalem?
Well, here's the thing.
Once.
He was
He only visited Jerusalem once.
All right. I was not saying he was on there to be an eyewitness, but his family and himself were definitely connected to Jerusalem and the goings on. They were politically involved. They were economically involved. If something like, for instance, all the dead holy men out of Jerusalem came out of their graves and walked, he wouldn't be talking about the lame-ass things that were happening in Jerusalem at the time. He'd be talking about that. And in fact, everybody would be talking about that, even if only one guy came out of his grave and would appear to many in Jerusalem.
So, like, there's a guy named Honi the Circle Drawer who's supposed to have made
the rabbi
appear. How many people talk about him?
Well, we know about him today because people did talk about him.
How many people? How many sources do we have for Honi?
You know,
I think we got one.
Maybe we have one.
Apologist of Tiana. How many sources do we have for him?
Well, if you trust the chain of evidence that makes it, we've got 4. I don't particularly.
No, we do not.
I don't. And I agree with you, I don't. But here's the thing.
My point is, we have other people who seem to do miracle workers, and you don't have them left and right. And when miracle workers are recorded, like, for example, in the Talmud or by Celsus, they say he was a magician. So it's not really a big deal. But another charlatan, a magician, leading people astray.
The difference between that is you're saying that Jesus was the real deal, and that he actually did these things, that they were only legend to be. And we have a list.
Well, not necessarily. But remember, I believe in the supernatural. I don't necessarily deny that there can be like what you might call false miracles. So not necessarily. I don't know.
Let me ask you this, because we have so many lists, and I want to mention them in our next book, of all these other loser messiahs and wannabe miracle workers who were so far less interesting than Jesus, even if Jesus was just a guy with these radical new teachings. And yet they made the historical record.
Who and where? Who are these guys?
I got 2 pages right here. Let me just listen. John the Baptist, for one, he made the record in a way that Jesus didn't.
Which corroborates the New Testament, not denies the New Testament.
Well, no, because we know John the Baptist.
Messiah.
Hang on a second. We know John the Baptist was real, or we have a much better chance of thinking John the Baptist was real, whether he was connected to Jesus or not. And in fact, in the Gospels, every single Gospel gives a different relationship to John the Baptist and Jesus, making it very
Did John the Baptist, according to any source extent, claim to be the Messiah?
No. Well, actually, that's not true. His followers
I asked you, did anyone, any source extent?
Yes.
What's the source?
The Clementine recognitions, they not only say that John the Baptist was the Messiah, they preserve the debates with Christians saying that John the Baptist was the Messiah.
Vocab, that's enough of an introduction for me. Why don't you sort of take us in the direction we need to go for this segment?
Well, David and I on the break agreed that we'll go to Josephus. He's usually the first guy brought up in these discussions about extra-biblical witnesses to Jesus. And so I would want to argue to David, there's a number of reasons. I have more than 3, but I'll just give him 3 why I think not just I, but most Josephian scholars believe that this testimonium, where the place where Josephus, this ancient Jewish historian, refers to a so-called Messiah named Jesus there in his book of Antiquities. And I want to give some reasons why most scholars believe it does have Christian interpolation, but it's authentic on the whole. The first reason is that a lot of people knew that there was some fishy stuff going on there because a lot of the copies we had Josephus saying Jesus is the Messiah and rose from the dead. And everyone's like, well, that doesn't fit with Josephus. That doesn't fit with anything else. Was Josephus a Christian? No, he wasn't. So there must have been some sort of holy tampering. Someone's like, he's not just a man. He's he's more than a wise man. It's how could you say that about Jesus?
Absolutely.
So the Christians adding stuff in 3, perhaps 4 main spots, it seems. But fortunately, Shlomo Pines in 1971 brought forth an Arabic copy of Josephus. That's later, I think from the 10th century, if I'm not mistaken. And in that, all that fluff part is out, and now we have it just like the parts the scholars wanted to take out. They said don't match Josephus. It doesn't have those in there. And so that lets us know there's still a manuscript tradition that goes back to something totally in line with Josephus, what he would say. And the other reason, I'll just give 2, not 3 reasons.
Okay.
The other reason is the language Josephus uses. He uses the word tribe 11 other times. He uses the phrase about this time in a number of other places. I have the references here. He calls Solomon and Daniel wise men, the same way he calls Jesus, which no Christian would call Jesus merely a wise man. He refers to incredible deeds in a few places, usually in relation to prophets like Elijah. He uses the phrase leading men a number of times. He uses the phrase divine prophets. And all of these find their way in this passage that Josephus, where he mentions Jesus. So the language matches something Josephus as a Jew and as a personal historian would write, not something a Christian would write. So there's good evidence. Those are just 2 reasons. What you wanted to respond to?
Yeah, I want to respond to both. And actually, you're exactly right about right from the get-go, people thought this was strange. Yeah, because again, for all the reasons you say that, it's like it's Orthodox Jews supposed to be saying this.
What's going on here?
And the thing to keep in mind. First, you bring up Shlomo Pines and the Agapian manuscript. First of all, Shlomo Pines himself said, now I want to caution you, this does not mean that this is the original. And in fact, the passage itself, the Agapes actually doesn't even get the name of the book right. And it's clear that he is just paraphrasing what he remembered. We don't think these were the exact words. Shlomo didn't think they were the exact words either. And there's been other scholars who also argue that this is from the 10th century. It is also going back to a manuscript tradition that ultimately dates to the guy I think forged it, Eusebius of Caesarea. You mentioned the vocabulary, and just quickly I'm going to say, superficially there are a lot of similarities to him, but it's the same way like Joseph Smith's Book of Mormon has superficial similarities to the Bible. It's just his faking. And there's other ways that the words that he uses and the way he describes things are completely opposite of how Josephus does in his
What's
real
an example?
For example, he never uses the word Gentiles. He always calls them Syrians or Greeks, wherever they are. He never refers to any Messiah as anyone but his patron Vespasian as a Messiah, because all the rest would be charlatans and imposters, and that's what.
Right. Well, Josephus didn't really want to promote the idea of Messiah to his Roman audience, and also.
Well, no, that's not true. That's not true. He did want to promote it, but he wanted to promote it as Vespasian being Messiah.
Right. But what I mean is with the true Jewish expectation of it, because of the violent, perhaps, expectation of political overthrow by the Romans. It's not. You see the other Messiahs you mentioned earlier in the first break.
Right.
And the other thing is that the Greek word for Messiah doesn't really have great theological import to just a Greek reader. Right. It just means like anointed one.
But let me stop.
Or even slick, oily one. That's what it could mean.
Exactly.
So it's not a big deal that he says he was called the Messiah, which matches up with the James passage.
Here's the thing. What I want to stop you there is because before we get too wrapped up in does it or doesn't, we have to remember this passage doesn't appear until 300 years after the fact, and we have church father after church father after church father who we have long commentaries on Josephus. They never say anything remotely like this. Origen even complains that we don't have passages like this in this book.
That's not what he says, David.
That is exactly what he says.
Here's what he says. He says, Josephus doesn't think Jesus is the Messiah. Here's my question. How would he know that unless Josephus has a passage that doesn't recognize Jesus as the Messiah? How would he know that?
Because all he says just before that, yes, Jesus did all these amazing things, but what source do we have for him outside of the Gospels?
And he gives a source.
And here's the thing. He doesn't give the source because Josephus doesn't say that.
No, but
And for 300 years, nobody quotes this until Eusebius. And then everyone starts quoting it everywhere.
But see, here's the thing. How does Origen know Josephus does not think Jesus is the Messiah unless he has a textual
Because
indication?
Josephus is a Jew. That's sufficient.
Oh, so see, then your argument's not even textual. It's based upon his prior theology. You're arguing a textual thing. Now you're flipping over to Josephus' theological presupposition.
All I'm saying is that it's sufficient for him to be a Jew for him not to believe in the Messiah.
Another question. How could Josephus, he wouldn't even think Jesus is the Messiah. First of all, he's already got sort of his own Messiah. He's not that interested in Jesus, as we could see even from this limited passage. But the thing is, Origen could not know unless Josephus makes mention of
that's where I disagree.
And the thing is that
because
David,
all you need
another
to do,
passage,
what's the other passage?
where he says James, whose brother is the so-called Messiah.
And I talk about that in the book at great length.
Here's why your answer is wrong. Because here's what. Because Josephus says the brother of the so-called Messiah. You're trying to say that's another Jesus.
The same Jesus that's in the passage.
Here's the problem.
The same one that's in the passage.
Yeah, and how does he refer to that Jesus? By his father's name.
All right.
So you have to switch the guy from referring to his brother to his father to make it the same guy, but it's not. It's Jesus the Christ.
No, wait a minute.
Backpack Radio.
It's so not. Seriously.
That is true.
That is not. You just have to read it.
Jesus ben Ananias.
Read the passage.
Josephus switches the indication in the middle of it. He calls him Jesus ben Ananias.
But
and then he
that
calls him
passage
Jesus.
wasn't even the original thing. That's a margin.
That's your argument. That's your whole argument.
Here's the thing. If it really is talking about Jesus, the brother of James, are we recording this? We should. This is good stuff.
I mean, it's amazing.
No, I'm kidding.
Oh yeah. But if it's talking about Jesus, brother James, why is it nothing that happens to this guy matches anything we know about James the Just, who was the head of Jerusalem truth?
You understand this different argument, right? And it's not nothing. He dies around the same time, and he dies for the same reasons.
No, he doesn't. You guys he gets stoned by the Sanhedrin. This guy gets beaten by...
The method of death is not identical.
Nothing's identical. There's nothing is the same.
The timing of death?
The timing? You mean they both died in the first century?
No, they both died like around under the same
1036,
gap of rulership. So it's not nothing. It's just the stuff you're saying should be there.
Reread that section.
It's an overstatement to say nothing.
Reread that section.
You know no one agrees with you, though.
That's not true either.
Besides Richard Carrier. I mean, no
10 years ago, I probably would have said that. It felt like that,
Right.
but that's not true anymore.
In studio with David Fitzgerald, author of the book Nailed 10 Christian Myths That Show Jesus Never Existed at All. Talking about extra biblical sources for Jesus. And David, you wanted to really finish off something from the last segment about Josephus. I want to hand it over to you now.
Yeah, we were talking about Flavius Josephus because he's the one most commonly brought up. And there's lots of arguments that we've been given back and forth, and there's more to be said. But the one I wanted to make was that Bart Ehrman brought this up, and we don't agree on everything about Jesus by any stretch, but he made a point that even if every single word in the Testimonium Flavinium is true, that was written around 93 or 94. It's way, way after the fact, and it doesn't change the fact that of the time when Jesus was supposed to be doing all these things, we don't have anybody taking notice of them, and that is really just as from...
You know what your argument assumes, right?
Well, I assume that if these things really happen, people would have noticed them.
No, your argument assumes the gospel do not have eyewitness accounts of them. You just said someone should be taking note, but then I'm just saying the gospels aren't that.
Well, I am assuming that because there's clues in the Gospels that say they aren't eyewitnesses. They never claim to be eyewitnesses.
Like John, at the end of John 20 where it says
tacked on and says, oh, this was, by the way, this was written by the beloved disciple, and we know it's true because he told us so. That's not written by anything
or
remotely.
Where Luke says he interviews eyewitnesses.
Where does he say he interviews eyewitnesses?
In the beginning,
he certainly says he looks into things. He never says anything about interviewing eyewitnesses.
Those who saw it from the beginning, I mean, you can read the Luke 1. But I'm just saying, when the Gospels do have it, you say it doesn't count.
Well, here's the thing. We can break down why I don't like what the Gospel's saying, why I don't think they're, we can do that. That's a whole other show. But we're going to be gone in 10 minutes, you know? Yeah. Oh, no, we didn't even scratch the surface on that. We didn't even scratch the surface.
But I'm saying you can proceed with the argument, but just make sure for the Christian, they have to at least realize the assumption built into it. When he says no one is writing these things down, it's assuming the Gospels are not that.
And I'm talking about corroboration for the Gospels.
Okay, but
I'm
that's
talking
a different argument.
It is, but here's the thing. But if you say that the Gospels are eyewitnesses, first of all, they're not. And second of all, the synoptic problem, you're very well familiar with, shows that Mark is the source for Matthew and Luke's Gospels.
Have you read the biographies of Alexander or Julius Caesar? Do they match up identically?
And I'm not talking about matching up identity.
Okay,
I'm talking
well,
I am talking about these things. This is how they match up. They're either in lockstep.
Standards.
I am losing the same standards. Here's the thing.
Okay.
You're saying, it's eyewitness accounts, and so there's going to be differences. And I agree. But these aren't that kind of witness. These are plagiarisms and deliberate alterations and changes. They're either lockstep, word for word, taken, cut and paste, literally cut and pasted, or they're saying a story that's completely incompatible with the other story.
Okay, so...
And that's not eyewitness. That's not eyewitness difference. That's something completely different.
We disagree. And here's the thing. Here's the challenge I have for the Christ myth sort of industry in general.
Oh, if it's the industry, I'm in the wrong industry. It pays.
Like, David, your book doesn't really, and I understand it as like a sort of a digest of the arguments. But
sure.
It's, even a lot of the other guys, I never really see them interacting with the cutting edge. I don't see them interacting with anything about the names. For example, all the names we found on ossuaries and how they match up to the biblical names. I never see, this is recent research, this ossuary inscription digging stuff. I never see that. I never see them interacting with Richard Bauckham, Jesus and Eyewitnesses, which is, regardless of if you agree with it or not, it's a pretty, watershed book that has a lot of people having to interact with it. You never see them interacting with Larry Hurtado, who talks about the proof of the early Christians worshiping Jesus. And these are, these heavy-duty guys who are respected on both sides. I never see anyone interacting with this. I just see them kind of the lowest hanging fruit, or what a Christian says on the street. The only exception sometimes is Richard Carrier, but he's the one guy, and I don't really think he does that well.
Well, that's not true. You got Richard Carrier, and absolutely his current book now, Proving History, is that's going to be a watershed book. But his next book on the historicity of Jesus is going to be doing just exactly what you're saying. He's taking the arguments for a minimal mythicism and the argument for a minimal historicism, and just crunches the numbers using Bayesian analysis, point by point, to see how it matches up. That's a book I think you're going to want to read. As far as anybody, whether you're talking about Reza Aslan, whether you're talking about Bruce Metzger, anyone who's saying anything about what the eyewitnesses' quality of the Bible, you have to say, well, what are our sources for that? And we haven't even touched that.
You got to read Richard Bauckham's book.
We haven't touched,
to mention Reza Aslan and Richard Bauckham in the same breath, I'm just saying
there's a lot of people out there. Well, there's a lot of people out there saying a lot of things about Jesus, and a lot of it's crap on the mythicist side.
Right.
But the good stuff is what we should be dealing with.
That's the stuff I'm mentioning, top level stuff.
All right. Good discussion. One more segment. We want to get started pretty quickly here, but I just had to, I know I'm moderator, but I wanted to throw in one quick question. One of the things that maybe some of our listeners might be wondering is, maybe perhaps Jesus was, he was significant, but not nearly as significant to warrant the Romans' attention. We're expecting all this stuff to be written about him during his time period when, in fact, maybe we should see him as really involved in sort of the backwaters of Palestine. It's really only afterwards that Christians began to believe certain things about Jesus, and then you saw the movement sort of go from there. I think you termed it. I think atheists will describe this as the stealth Messiah. Is that how you describe it?
Because I get that argument a lot from atheists who try to tell me that yes, there really was a Jesus, not that he was Son of God or anything, but there really was a historical guy. And the question I have with that is, if that's true, I mean, the whole crux of the book Nailed stems on this thing that if Jesus did all these amazing things and fantastic miracles, no one seems to have noticed outside his little cult for over 100 years. Or he didn't do these things, and yet as soon as he's dead, you've got all these scattered house churches throughout the empire, from Syria to Egypt to Rome, that can't agree about the basic facts of his life. And it's that disconnect, coupled with the fact that we do have all this information about all these loser messiahs and would-be messiahs who were so much less interesting than our Jesus, and yet they made the historical record and our Jesus didn't. That's the kind of thing that I think, how could there even be a guy named Jesus, for me personally? Here's
the trouble with the overstatement. All this information, okay, who else do we have biographies for?
Let me turn a page or two here.
I'm
not talking about making biographies. I'm talking about...
But we have biographies for Jesus.
Yeah.
They're referred to it. What other loser Messiah do we have biographies for?
Why does it have to be biographies? Why can't
because you're saying all the... If you're going to use the phrase all this information, it's got to at least exceed what Jesus has.
We have all these mentions of this that we don't get for Jesus from any of these. They would rather put a small paragraph about some guy who was a bogus Messiah, and yet this real Messiah who really had multitudes.
Who's the they?
All throughout the first century.
Who were mentioning messiahs besides Josephus?
throughout the first century, we get mentions of over almost a dozen other guys.
By who?
By people like Flavius Josephus, by Nicholas of Damascus.
We talked about Nicholas. I'm not actually 100% sure if Nicholas has other loser messiahs in there, because I've been looking at his work, which we really don't have much of.
Well, you already mentioned like Apollonius of Tyana. You know,
that's not. Like he wasn't a Jewish messiah. He was a Greek wise man.
We have. What I'm saying is,
and it's one biography. My point is,
and I'm not. But that's not the point. The
you're making an overstatement. No, but
what I'm saying is, these guys made
information.
No, here's what I'm saying.
That's what you said.
All these guys made a dent in the historical record. They made a footprint. They made a footnote in the historical record.
Tell me about
I'm not
their
saying
dent.
we had biographies. I'm just saying that they did much less interesting things, and they had much less interesting events. And yet, these spectacular events we see in the Bible, no one
leading an army out into the wilderness and getting a bunch of people slaughtered. Is that more interesting, or getting crucified?
Is that more interesting than the entire world being covered by supernatural darkness for 3 hours? Or two massive earthquakes striking Jerusalem?
Right,
or dead holy men coming out of their graves and appearing to many?
The first two things you said are mentioned. You know that, right? That's another discussion. Flagon, for example.
Oh, you got to read my book, because if you're going to bring
I've read your book.
Yeah,
my point is, though, you're saying stuff and people aren't aware that the darkness and earthquakes actually are mentioned. And my point is, though, about the other loser messiahs is what is more interesting, a guy getting hung up on a cross or a guy leading a giant rebellion, an army? See, it's like all your explanations are ad hoc.
Wait a second.
It's like,
are you saying that's all Jesus did? You're saying he didn't have a triumphant
No, but which is a bigger deal? Which is a bigger deal?
Wait, let me just ask you this.
Which does Rome take more note of? An army that got squashed, or one guy that got killed?
Let me ask you this. When he's leading a multitude throughout Judea, throughout the Galilee, down into Judea, multitudes are following him, triumphant procession, you're saying they wouldn't take notice of that?
A triumphant procession of Jews into Jerusalem. That
Passover.
So what?
How about your procession?
That?
Okay, wait. Let's go back, because this kills me. No one seems to give me a solid answer for this. How do you have anybody, let alone several holy people, get out of their graves in Jerusalem, wander the streets of Jerusalem, appearing to many? How does anybody miss that at all? At all?
Watch this, David. Let's just say, and I don't agree. Let's just say though that line is not true. Let's just say it. That doesn't disprove Jesus' existence. It's actually irrelevant to your case. You're bringing it up because it sounds fantastical.
It does sound fantastical.
My point is, though, even if that is a fabrication, which I do not say it is.
So how do you explain it not appearing anywhere else?
Well, okay, the Gospels don't need to ape each other, first of all.
No, I'm not trying to... I'm telling you, no one noticed this. How come we know about all these boring things that were happening around Jerusalem at that time, but we don't know about that?
We don't actually... What boring things do we know about?
Like your army thing.
That's not boring.
Is it okay? What's more? All right. Show of hands, radio audience. Show of hands. Who's more interested in people rising from the dead, or just one more rebellion in backwater?
Let's just say you're right. You got to understand. Just strictly logically speaking, let's say that was a fabrication. It does not disprove the existence of Jesus.
I'm not basing my argument on that, but I'm saying
then
it's just one more in a case.
No,
it's one more in a case.
That actually is not. See, that's what I'm saying.
If that was the
a
only
little bit of a corner here.
Wait. I just want to say, if that was the only thing that people didn't notice, maybe you'd have a point. But there's all these things are happening, and no one notices outside the cult.
Okay.
Well, Tacitus. let's move to that particular source.
So Tacitus is a Roman historian writing in the early 100s, and in Annals 1544, here's what he says. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Now here's what I'm going to say. There's a larger passage in which he's talking about Christians. When he talks about the origin of this movement, he gives some historical checkpoints. Here's what I'm going to say. This will show, your answer is going to show that the Christmas theory relies upon evasion. It has to evade data versus really solid explanations.
Not at all.
Not at all. The answer you're going to give right now is going to evade the clear historical. It's so easy to see what he's doing. It's just, you could just accept it and not believe Jesus is the Messiah. But there it is. What do you do with that?
When you look at anything like this, first of all, you have to ask, why was no one saying this 100 years earlier? For one thing, why is he just talking about Christians? We know Christians existed. We know what Christians told people about, that they worshipped a guy named Christ who was crucified under Pilate. This was word in the street. Everybody who knew anything about Christians knew this basic stuff. And there are so many biblical scholars, not even secular biblical scholars, who agree that this is not saying anything except witness about what Christians believed in the 2nd century. That's it. And you could say the same thing for Suetonius. You could say the same thing for any number of those 2nd century witnesses.
Oh, so you're saying he's just repeating Christian information?
Exactly.
Okay, question
Exactly.
then why does he call Pontius Pilate a procurator, which no Christian document does? It calls him a prefect. If he's getting it from Christians, then why doesn't he use the correct term prefect, which the Gospels do? You see what I'm saying? They don't refer to him as a procurator like Tacitus does.
Are you saying that as he's talking about this in passing while discussing other things, he's actually getting it right because he's got the official documents?
And why is he using the sort of slang Latin colloquial Christus instead of what Christians would call him? Christians made fun of pagans for misspelling Jesus' name all the time. You know this, right? Tertullian, Origen, like you call this and you don't really know it means good, but that's not how, you know.
Right.
Okay, so if this is from Christians, then why does it sound like something a pagan Roman would say?
Because he is a pagan Roman saying this.
Right, so how do you know it's from Christians?
I'm saying that nothing we get from anybody in the 2nd century is anything that any Christian could tell them. You're being fixated on the fact that he uses the correct term. That just means that he knows what that should have been called.
Okay, so here's the thing.
And again, where was these guys? Where are people like this in the New Testament? Where are people like this in the 1st century? I mean, when we hit
you're
in
not,
Acts,
okay,
in Acts,
you're not
when
answering
you
the question.
We're
talking
how am
about
I not?
Tacitus.
Okay, all right, keep going.
Here's the thing. Tacitus did. Do you know in History's 440? He tells of a time when the Senate asked Emperor Domitian if they could consult the imperial archives, and they were granted access. Tacitus also cites Senate records in Annals 5.4 and 1574. And many Tacitian scholars believe he had this kind of access to this kind of information. Furthermore, there is official and semi-official records as well. Rome's public libraries, Daily Public Gazette. He seems to know Pliny. He could have got information from him.
He could have gotten Pliny information from the interrogation that Pliny talks about in his letter.
Right. So my point is, though, it's not just this one source. And in fact, there's a time where Tacitus quotes Pliny, and he says, now, Pliny says this, and it seems absurd, but I'll quote it anyway. So it's not as if he never checks up on the sources. I mean, do you think Tacitus, who, like, obviously is no fans of Christians, is just going to assume what they say is true and just go ahead with it? Or is this clearly common public knowledge that you don't even need to go, perhaps even do some special checking, because it's pretty obvious, oh, this is the fact that this guy, I don't really care about him, and now the Christians are being tortured. Here's the information, which matches up with the Gospels. I bet you, David, if it had radically different things about Jesus, like Jesus, was killed by stoning, and then, if you would say, oh, look, here's contradictory information, but since it accords with the Gospel, it's just hearsay.
We do have information like that, and I do say it's just hearsay, actually.
Where?
In the early Jewish writings, like the Mishnah, it's clearly a parody of those things. So that the fact that that's the kind of different information, that doesn't interest me that much.
Well, those are later than Tacitus.
Absolutely, and that's part of the reason I put even less weight to those.
Yeah, but they're obviously, the funny thing is on the big details, they do match up sort of the Jewish side of the story. Witnesses were called forth. And
because it's a parody of that story. Yes. Yeah. But let me get back to Tacitus. Sure. Because the problem I have is we focus on people like Tacitus and Suetonius because that's all we have. That's all we what I'm saying. Hey, hang on. What I'm saying is from the whole 1st century.
Yeah.
For almost the entire majority of that time, and certainly during the time when Jesus was actually active and when all these things should have been on the radar, nothing. We get nothing.
That's simply not true. The reason why we focus it is because it shows that the Christ myth doesn't have any legs to stand on. We're not like desperately grasping. We know the historical evidence for Jesus is secure. Even people like Bart Ehrman do. Look, I never resort to this argument, but it was interesting. In our last show, I mentioned that I believe Paul wrote 1 Timothy, and you said, well, most mainstream scholars don't agree, and I said, yes, I'm aware of that.
Yep.
And then you caught me back later and said, you can't just brush that off. I think you went by that a little too quickly.
Yeah.
And it's really, I thought that was ironic for someone who holds that Jesus never existed to tell me you need to be aware of mainstream scholarship about the authorship of a Christian document when it's even less accepted the idea that there was no historical Jesus. Don't you see that seems...
And I get that, but here's the thing. I have to have reasons for everything I argue, especially whether it agrees with the mainstream or when it disagrees.
But you understand my point, though. If you're going to tell me, hey, you better don't go so fast on
and all I meant to say that is that it's not atheists making this up. Good, strong Christian scholars believe that those
First Timothy. But here is an irony, and I don't like doing arguments for motivation, but it is ironic. I don't know of any non-atheist scholar who holds to the Christ myth theory, other than the mythical type folks who
why would you expect a Christian scholar to accept it?
David, have you... The thing is, if you... See, I feel like...
Because that's kind of an extraordinary thing to say.
No, David, do you think New Testament scholars are Christians?
I I think from the beginning it's been dominated by Christians. Yes.
Have you? I mean,
and I know the non-Christians
like
out
Rudolf
there.
Bultmann. We need to demythologize the New Testament. Bart Ehrman. I mean, there's like a. I'm not sure if you're aware of the current state of New Testament.
Oh, I'm aware.
scholarship.
Oh, believe me, baby,
It's not
I am
dominated
aware.
by non-beer drinking fundamentalist Baptists. It's dominated by a whole set of other folks.
Because they're the only ones doing the work. Everybody else is circling the wagons to keep out new ideas.
And why do no non-atheist New Testament scholars believe your theory?
Because they work for Jesus.
Oh, it's like people at Duke University. Mark Goodacre works for Jesus.
You tell me.
Duke University. I don't think that's a Jesus institution. But it was a lot of fun, and David is a cool guy, and I enjoyed having coffee with you this morning.
Me too, and I love being here. Great meeting you guys, and I'd love to come back anytime and yell at you more.
Appreciate having you here.
You know, I would like you to like be a beta reader on my next book, because it would be good. Because I do tend to
I'm down with that.
Keep in mind, I say things like Timothy wasn't written by Paul in this discussion without getting into why he didn't write it.
Well, I know you.
Just to make it, just so I can bring in that this is not stuff I'm making up, or this is not stuff atheists are making up.
Right.
This is like majority scholarship stuff. I want to point out when I'm bucking the majority opinion, when I'm along with the majority opinion.
I'd be down to be a beta reader.
Yeah.
I've never done that for a book.
Yeah.
I've done it for some small academic papers, but that'd be awesome.
And honestly, it's the atheists who piss me off the most about that. I didn't expect Christians to like my book, but when atheists get in my face, it's like, stuff like that on some of the lamest points of evidence. And Bart Ehrman, I love Bart Ehrman, but he's so wrong on the historical Jesus issue, so wrong.
Well, I mean, I'm not upset by all the Jesus never existed and this and that. The reason why I like it in a certain way is because it gives us a good chance to talk about all other kinds of important things that are important no matter what you think or whatever, like, the texts, the manuscripts, and all kinds of other factors.
And that should be hidden. I mean, we want to. Those are things that are worth knowing about.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Where they stand on. So.
And there's so much. What do you call it? Not presuppositions exactly, but I guess there's the expectation that the Gospels were eyewitnesses, and it's like, whoa, wait, no, they weren't. There's all these different points of argument that are accepted on one side or the other, but need to be argued about before we can even say those as facts.
We didn't get to talk about this in obviously show because we had to move on to Tacitus, but so I wanted to explore a little bit more of the holy man thing.
Yeah.
Let me just sort of tease this out a little bit. I mean, you're saying why didn't more people mention it or know it? I mean, isn't it too much to speculate? I mean, if you think about it, they don't have photographs, they don't have cell phones.
Sure.
So someone comes out and let's say, who knows? Someone comes out of the tomb and starts, speaking about different things. There's no,
or a whole bunch of someone. That's the thing. I mean, if we
we don't know how many.
I mean, I've been accused by Christians of using it as a straw man argument when I'm just quoting Matthew saying he says many.
Well, no, but I'm teasing that out though.
Yeah.
So let's say
He says
like one verse.
Many came out of many saints came out of their graves and appeared, or did they all of them? I can't remember.
No, it says many.
Many, and appeared to the streets of Jerusalem.
So many, 5, 6.
So we're talking about lots of people coming out of the graves, and lots of people saw this. Yeah.
Well, lots of people saw them.
They wandered to the streets, appearing to many.
But there's no way of knowing at that moment whether or not people recognize. Well, these are. I mean, how would they know? Well, wait a minute. This is Moses. Wait a minute. This is. You see what I'm saying? Until maybe after the fact.
Exactly. I mean, I don't know how, when you're having a vision of the Transfiguration, that they know, oh, that's Moses, that's Elijah, but somehow they did.
You're talking about a supernatural event at that point.
Aren't we talking about when that? This?
As I'm saying, so at what point, I mean, again, that's written even after the fact.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's just...
that appears in one place and nowhere else in the world, that floors me.
That there's only one place where that happens?
Matthew only mentions that in one verse, and nobody mentions anything remotely like that ever.
Well, I mean, this gets into why is one person mentioning it, why does another person mention it, right? I mean,
sure.
But do you see what I'm saying? In other words, if assuming something like that happened, I mean, it's not too much to speculate that people would be confused and unsure about it. Until way later on.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's
so easy to write a story.
Matthew's writing saying this is the Messiah, right? But I mean, there's and again.
And when we say Matthew, I don't say Matthew wrote because I don't think there was a Matthew, and I don't think the guy who wrote that book was trying to pass him off as any disciple. or any of the Gospels were trying to pass themselves off as an eyewitness or a Gospel.
Yeah.
I mean, as a biography.
Yeah.
But even if all 4 Gospels said that line or something like that, it's not like you would believe it.
Well, no, because they're ultimately they're based on Mark, and so anything we get from any of the 4 Gospels, we could talk about just the Gospels and why they are or aren't reliable, and what's reliable in them and what's not.
But like the thing is, on one hand you're like, well, not even the other Gospels mention it, but why is that relevant to you? Because it's not. I mean, do you believe the feeding of the 5,000, which does appear in all 4 Gospels? Do you believe that happened?
Let me put this way. Everything that seems to come out of the Gospels seems to come out of Mark's Gospels, and everything in Mark's Gospel seems to be an allegory. So in that sense, that's an allegory, right?
So what's a good example of a contemporary allegory that talks like Mark's Gospel does?
Yeah, but Greek. I mean, the original Greek that's there. It's very short. It's terse.
Right.
Did this. Did that. Did this. Did that. I mean, it doesn't seem to bear the marks.
It's in a coiny Greek that's very folksy. It's like Andy Griffith talk,
But again, we're almost.
It's written by a very educated guy who's like, he could write very highfalutin Greek, but he doesn't. He writes in this folksy, comfortable.
But what's an example of the genre? A Jewish Messiah genre in the simplified, stripped down way that is an allegory from the 1st century. Like, are you just Mark invented a new genre of literature? What's an example of the genre you're saying Mark is?
I'm getting a question. I don't know if he was the one who invented this or not. I'd have to think about that. But what I do know is when we see all the symbolic elements in there. For instance, I talk about in the book about the Barabbas, how that thing is really, that whole incident about Barabbas being released instead of Jesus is a allegory for the Yom Kippur ritual. I mean, there's just no doubt about it. And biblical scholars, once they see that, it's like they can't unsee it. It's like, oh man, you're so right. And there's things like that repeated throughout his gospel. There's a real weird thing that Mark says in Mark 4:11. And it feels to me that he's setting what this whole thing is about. He's saying, he has Jesus telling his followers, I'm giving you the key to the mystery of the kingdom of God. And that's what I think his whole gospel is. His whole gospel is a Jewish version of the mystery faith.
But what does mysterion mean in the lips of a Greek-speaking Jew?
Let me tell you what he says.
You're saying mystery, and English speakers think Scooby-Doo. What does the word
Greek mystery faith? The mystery faith.
That's not what mysterion means on the lips of a Greek-speaking Jew. It just simply means something now revealed. That's the lexical understanding. You see, when you say mystery in English, here's it one way.
When you see him using that same word that the non-Jewish mystery faiths use, how can you say, oh, well, because a Jew is saying it doesn't...
That's not how lexical sources work. You don't say, oh, they use the same word, therefore it has the same meaning.
Hang on a second. When you have two different religions, they both have a Lord's Supper, they both have the same ritual.
What's the other religion?
All those mystery faiths had Lord's Suppers. In fact, Paul tells us that. He says, now this is our Lord's Supper, not their Lord's Supper. You can't drink from the table of demons and from ours.
Okay, so what is...
And there's many Kyrioi, but for us there's only one.
Right, in the Septuagint, what is the Greek translation for Adonai or Yahweh? What's the Greek translation they use in the Septuagint of the Hebrew? It's Kyrios, which is Lord. So when Paul is saying it, it's the way that a Greek-speaking Jew would refer to deity. It's not just this. It's not like, because if you read.
What is your point?
My point is when he's saying Lord's Supper, it's not identical to someone who believes in multiple deities saying Lord.
How is it not? Okay,
the Septuagint was made before the New Testament. It's a Greek translation of the Hebrew Scripture. Whenever they had the Hebrew word Adonai, which was the word they would use instead of Yahweh, which is the divine name, they would always say Kyrios.
Okay,
so now
I'm just not seeing how this supports your point.
Greek-speaking Jews who are now followers of Jesus Christ the Messiah, when they say Lord's Supper, Kyrios, the word they're using, it's radically different than when a pagan who believes in multiple deities.
How is it radically different?
Because it's the term they use for Yahweh.
How is that different?
Because pagans don't have a Yahweh. They have a bunch of gods.
Here's the thing. You're making the big deal that because we have a Lord and they have a Lord.
No, I'm saying
that our Lord is better because we have a real God behind it.
The whole way they would utilize the word Kyrios is radically different.
How do you know that? They're using exactly
because I know what pagans believed. See, do you understand how simplistic it is? It's like facile to say you use the same word, therefore you mean the same thing.
It's not
No
just
one,
using the
no
same
historian
word.
argues that
They're
way.
using the same word in the same context, in the same ritual.
But they're not, because it's on the lips of a Greek-speaking Jew. It is
and that
not.
changes nothing. That changes nothing. is what I'm
David,
saying.
it's a
These
little scary
aren't-
because it
these-
makes it seem like you don't pay attention to the fact that this is all within a Jewish context. That's why
This is all in a
trouble.
first century Jewish context,
That's-
where there's not one single Jewish context.
But that's why
And
you're having.
Judaism at this time is mingling with paganism. That's what I'm
It
saying.
isn't too much to suggest that linguistically.
Mm.
I mean, you can ecclesia, for example, word used.
And I get crap for that when I say, upon my rock it'll build this
Yeah,
church.
your argument's really
No,
based
but
on
I'm
English.
talking about that word.
It's so not.
That
Here.
word literally
Yeah.
means assembly.
Right.
Right.
It's
And yet
that term
it gets
would never be
reappropriated.
used in the sense that they're using it in that context.
And the
it
Septuagint,
wasn't something
I'm
that
talking
it
about,
would be built
in the
upon.
clause letters.
And that's why I'm saying it's an anachronism, is because at the time when they were doing that, it just meant an assembly at a gathering. It wasn't something you built. It wasn't a unit of structure.
No,
No,
they're
they're-
not.
that-
They were 300s.
New Testament wasn't using
What?
it.
no one built buildings
The
for
New
Christians.
Testament-
to
New
live in.
Testament-
I'm not
using
talking about
it.
building structure. I'm talking about church structures.
No, it was the early Christians used it for a gathering of people. They weren't necessarily speaking of like a church structure.
No,
So
no,
all
and- yeah,
I'm saying-
I'm not talking
Yeah,
buildings.
but
yeah.
even with that, though, I mean, to begin to use it in
But-
ways that are really very different
That-
from the original linguistic context.
And that's exactly what I'm saying. Is that when we see that in the Gospels, that they're saying that, and he says, "Upon this I will build my church." Nobody was using it that before this happened. If Jesus had really just
Well,
not
that's
said anything like
incorrect.
that,
That's
no one would have
incorrect.
known what the hell he was talking about.
That's incorrect because the Septuagint translates the assembly of Israel as ecclesia.
Ecclesia, but yes.
So
And that's what I'm saying. It's not something. It's not. We're not talking about a church the way the early Christians did.
when it says that they were
It's an
there,
anachronism.
when-
This use was an anachronism.
see, it's like you don't understand the Septuagint context of the way it shaped the Greek words they used. So it's not like no one was using it for a gathering of God's people. It was in the Septuagint already there.
Okay, I think we're talking past each other
You
because
see what I'm saying?
I think I do, but you're saying because it meant this, Christians gave it a new meaning.
I'm saying it's not.
And I'm agreeing with you.
I'm saying it's
And I'm
not
agreeing
a
with it. They
radical
did-
break.
No, it was used
at that
as
level.
in the Septuagint. It was used, in the Septuagint
As
an assembly of
as
God's
the congregation, right?
people. Assembly of God's people, and then in New Testament times, that already understanding of that definition then gets built upon and expanded in the New Testament.
Exactly.
times.
And what I'm
Which goes
saying
back to the original
but
point.
but see, that's what I'm saying. It later got expanded on and built and was adapted, co-opted as that use, but not at the time of Jesus. That was after that. That's
No,
what.
no,
So
see-
when you have somebody writing this,
No, but in the time
Yeah.
of Jesus, it's still, at the most basic level, all we needed to mean is an assembly of God's people, right? That's all it means. Now, reading it back in, we import other things, there's no doubt, but all it needs to mean is an assembly of the people of God gathered together. That's all it needs to mean. You see what I'm saying?
I do. I just.
So I don't need it to mean other things
Right.
until it means other things.
But I guess what I'm trying to say is that this isn't in a gospel written probably in the '70s, in the late '70s. At that time, there was an ecclesia that was built upon and was spreading. When the time he depicts in his gospel in the 30s, anyone who said, and it's not the only case where they say something that makes no sense at the time. Like when Jesus says to his followers, "Take up your cross and follow me," and they go, "Oh, okay." Nobody, he hasn't revealed that part of the story yet.
Yeah. Well, see,
But
again,
a
assuming
person could
Jesus
still
is-
use an analogy to understand what a person means.
Exactly.
What would that mean?
Well,
Take up your
assuming-
cross and follow me. Nobody would know what the hell he was talking
Yeah,
about.
and the Bible says the disciples didn't know what he
Yeah,
was
yeah.
talking about.
their response is right there. They didn't understand until later on.
Gotcha.
So it's possible. Jesus even using that term, ecclesia. Using it, that only becomes really significant and important. It's assuming, again, obviously you wouldn't agree with this, but assuming the written text there, Jesus comes and explains it after he's resurrected and says, "Okay, remember all the stuff I was saying? Well, now here's the full impact of what I was saying." You see what I'm saying?
I do, but there's other examples. None of these things that we've talked about tonight are the only example of what I'm talking about. For instance, like there's the verse where he says, "What good can come out of Nazareth?" That's an anachronism because people said that because Christianity came out of Nazareth, but it wasn't until about the time these Gospels were written that people were saying stuff like that.
But it goes back to the earlier point in terms of just I think the way that which it's a linguistic thing.
What you just said, you don't know. And Christianity didn't come out of Nazareth; it came out of Jerusalem.
But they're saying
There's not even an early Nazareth church that's spoken of in the
There's-
Gospels.
That term wasn't used. That pejorative sense wasn't used.
How do you
it
know?
became associated with Christianity.
But how do you know this?
We have Jewish writings about it.
Okay, but let's just say that's true. That doesn't mean that people didn't say that back then.
Well, that's exactly the point I'm making. That they didn't say it
No,
back then.
but you don't know that.
It took on. Well, we do know that
So because
we
they
have
said
Jews
it
talking about
later,
it.
they could not have said it, or because they said it later, they could not have said it earlier.
Well, the earliest evidence we have for them saying it is in reaction to Christianity after Christianity's arisen.
I'm not 100% sure that that's a phrase the pagans use about the Christians.
I'm not saying Christian. I'm not saying
Or even the Jews.
For sure.
See it, B? I'm not 100% sure that's the
Okay,
case.
really, all I'm trying to say is that your whole life is built on a lie and everything you know is false. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah.
That's all I'm saying.
But the thing is, like, it's not like we're like shaking our head and saying, have blind faith. We're arguing from lexical and linguistic, and we're not having to twist any meaning. We're just saying, here's what it means. What we're saying is, your interpretation of the data is incorrect. Not based in a first century context.
Thanks. And actually, I just want to start with a quick commercial break for tonight. I am going to be speaking to Arizona.
But they won't hear it. You showed us narrative for another.
No, never mind. Never mind.
Sorry.
But have fun tonight.
You guys really missed it 2 weeks
Yeah.
ago.